I have spent 7 years writing love stories that other people sign their names to, and I was 26 years old the first time I ever heard my own name said aloud to a room full of strangers. It happened at a book launch, the kind the whole Aldercroft publishing world turns out for. Press along the walls, the silver-haired matriarch in the front row, 400 important people gathered to hear the famously reclusive Sabine Aldercroft, 34 now, finally read from the love memoir the world had waited 10 years for. I stood at the very back, where a ghostwriter stands, holding a glass of wine nobody had thought to offer me, because not one person in that gilded hall knew the book they had come to worship had been built, sentence by sentence, by the invisible woman near the doors. 7 years before, when I was 19 and she was 27, that woman had told me I was nothing to her, that I had only ever been research.
Hi everyone! Thank you for staying with me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Stay close, stay connected.
And now she set the approved pages aside and turned to the last page, the one no one had ever been permitted to read. I want to tell you what she read. Not a lord or a lady or an invented city. She read about a gray coast, a cottage with a blue door, and a 19-year-old girl who read to her on the third step of a boathouse while the tide came up over their shoes. She read a name, she said, into the microphone, in front of the press and the matriarch and the 400, my real name, the one that has never once appeared on a cover. And she said she had loved that girl and lied to save her and spent 7 years writing every book except the only true one. And I stood at the back with a stranger's wine going warm in my hand and heard, for the first time in my life, someone say out loud the thing I had been certain I would carry to my grave unspoken. Then the whole room turned to look for me. I will get to that. But first, you have to understand how a woman becomes a ghost. I know how it sounds. I know the shape of the story you think you're about to hear. The poor girl and the rich woman, the secret summer, the cruel family, the grand public confession that fixes everything with a bow. Some of that is true. But this is not, in the end, a story about a confession, or a memoir, or a dynasty. It is a story about a name, about what it does to a person to spend her whole life writing other people into being seen, while she herself is kept carefully unseen. About a bond 2 women spent 7 years agreeing to call a lie, from 2 different kinds of silence, and could not kill. You cannot feel the weight of my name in that hall until you understand the 7 years of not being allowed to have one. So let me go all the way back to what I am and how I learned to disappear so completely that the woman I loved could hide our whole life inside a book and hand it to me to finish. My name is Nell Ashby, and I make my living being no one. That is the honest description of a ghostwriter. You take another person's memories and griefs and the loves they were too frightened to write down. You build them a book, and then you hand it over and take your fee and watch someone else's name go gold embossed on the cover of the most intimate thing you have ever made. I am good at it, one of the best there is, because I can hear the shape of a person under their own careless words and give it back truer than they could say it themselves. Actors, a general, a disgraced senator, a woman who climbed the mountain that killed her sister. I have been all of them on paper, and not one reader in the world has ever known my name. I used to tell myself that was the appeal, the safety of it. I was lying. You do not choose to be invisible for a living unless being seen once cost you everything you had. I became a ghostwriter because it was the exact shape of a wound. I had loved once, entirely, at 19, and been told to my face that it had never been real, and I had walked out of that summer with a bond mark low on my throat that would not heal clean, and a conviction that I did not get to have a love story of my own. So I gave myself everyone else's. I poured myself into other people's longing because I had sealed off my own. I wrote the confession and the reunion and the deathbed forgiveness for strangers 100 times over and called it craft. There is a particular safety in being the hand that writes the love and never the mouth that has to say it. No one can leave you in a book you are only ghosting. No one can turn in a crowded room and tell 400 people you were nothing. You are already no one. It cannot be taken because it was never once given. There is a mark low on my throat, and in 7 years, I have never explained it to a soul. It is a bond mark. Anyone of our kind would know it on sight. And it never healed the way a mark is supposed to, silvered and quiet. Mine stayed faintly warm, faintly wrong, a bond half-severed and stubbornly not dead, and I wore high collars and let people assume whatever they liked. Omegas carry a scent that gives us away, and mine, I am told, is bergamot and warm honey. I keep it damped down. I keep everything about myself damped down, precise and quiet, small and useful, taking the notes and asking the careful questions and disappearing. And the whole time, there is a thing in me screaming to be looked at directly, just once, by name. I had it locked in a back room of myself. And then an editor called to say the Aldercroft house wanted me for something delicate. And every wall I had spent 7 years building began, very slowly, to come down. You have to understand what Sabine Aldercroft was, to understand what it cost her to say my name. The Aldercrofts had published for 4 generations. They were not a company so much as a weather system. And Sabine was its heir and its brightest star at once. The reclusive genius, the author whose every book was an event, a woman of 34 who had won everything and let no one close enough to congratulate her. She was famously cold. The press called her the Aldercroft Frost. Interviewers came away empty-handed. She had not been photographed smiling in a decade. She had jet black hair, and eyes so dark they read as onyx, and she wore a heavy silver signet ring that she turned once with her thumb before she let herself say anything that mattered. I would come to know that tell better than my own heartbeat, but the world only saw the beautiful, locked front of her and decided there was nothing warm underneath. The world was wrong. I was the only living person who knew how wrong, and I had spent 7 years trying to forget it. She wrote everything except the one true thing. That was the secret grief of her whole celebrated career. She wrote invented loves, gorgeous and exact and faintly cold, love stories the critics called masterful studies of longing, and never once, in a decade of books, wrote the love that had actually happened to her. She wrote around it the way you write around a wound, and presiding over all of it was Honoria Aldercroft, Sabine's grandmother, the Iron Matriarch, silver-haired and straight-backed and 80 years old, a woman who had run the dynasty for half a century and never, by any account, lost a negotiation in her life. Honoria had built Sabine the way you build a flagship. Everything Sabine was, the discipline, the frost, the refusal to want anything out loud, Honoria had installed on purpose, because she believed, with her whole granite heart, that warmth was a liability the Aldercroft name could not afford. She had proof. She had spent 7 years being right about it, and she had made very sure of that herself. I should tell you about her scent, because it becomes the whole story later. Sabine smelled of cedar and cold rain and ink, dry and clean and a little dark, the smell of a locked library in a house by the sea. And the first time I got close enough to catch it, some animal thing in me that I had spent 7 years teaching to sleep sat straight up and turned toward her like a needle finding north, before my mind had any idea what my body already knew. That was later. In the beginning, she was only a name on a contract, the untouchable heir. Everyone who worked with Sabine Aldercroft described the same woman, controlled to the point of unnerving, generous with money and nothing else. A person who turned that silver ring once and then said something so final the conversation was over. Untouchable. That is the word they all used. I knew a different one. I had used it myself once on a gray coast at 19 before I learned exactly what it cost. The commission came through an editor named Mira Voss, who had used me twice before and trusted me to be discreet, which in my trade is the only reputation worth having. The Aldercroft house, she said, was finally publishing Sabine's love memoir, the one true story the great author had never told. And Sabine could not or would not write it herself. She had the material. She had years of it. What she did not have was the ability to shape it into something she could bear to let out of her hands. And so the house wanted a ghost. The best, the most invisible, someone who would build the rawest thing Sabine had ever produced into the memoir a decade of readers were waiting for, and then vanish. My name would appear nowhere. My fee would be enormous. My silence would be permanent. I said yes before I had finished thinking, because that is what you say, and because some part of me I did not examine too closely had gone very quiet and very alert at the sound of her name. They sent the material in a locked case, and I had ghosted senators and mountaineers and a woman whose sister died on a rope beside her, and I had never been handed anything like what was inside it. Not a manuscript, not even notes. Fragments. Hundreds of them, on loose pages and in 3 worn notebooks, some a single line, some a page and a half, and then nothing. All in a hard slanting hand I did not yet know I would come to dream about. A description of rain that came in sideways off the water and tasted of iron. A blue door, the 3rd step of a boathouse. A green glass float found on a beach and kept for 7 years. And running through all of it, circled and struck out and rewritten, one sentence she could not leave alone. You are the only thing I never had to calculate. I read the whole case in a single night, and by dawn my hands were cold, and I told myself it was only that the writing was extraordinary. I went on telling myself that for a long time. I fell in love with her through the fragments before I let myself understand what I was reading, and I fell the way you fall downstairs, all at once and backward and without dignity. It is a strange, specific intimacy, ghosting a memoir. You live inside another person's memory for months. You learn the grain of how they feel. And Sabine Aldercroft, who had never in a decade let an interviewer pass the frost, had put into that case the most naked writing I had ever read. Naked the way an open wound is naked. She wrote about a love she had lost with a precision that made my chest ache, a grief so controlled you could feel the enormous pressure it held back in every clipped perfect line. I sat in my small apartment night after night rebuilding a stranger's ruined heart, and somewhere in the 2nd week I realized I had started talking to her in my head. And by the 3rd, I did not want the commission to end, and I told myself that was craft too. I was becoming very good at telling myself things. We worked some of it in the same room. Sabine would not send the deepest material by any means she could not control. And so once a week, I went to the Aldercroft house, to a cold library that smelled of cedar and rain and old paper. And I sat across a long table from the most famous recluse in publishing and asked her careful, neutral questions about the love of her life. In daylight, she was exactly what the world believed, controlled, spare, unreadable, answering in the fewest possible words and turning the silver ring whenever I got too close. She did not look at me much. She called me Ms. Ashby. And then I would go home and find, in that hard, slanting hand, the raw, uncontrolled truth of the very thing she had just given me 4 cold words about. And the gap between the frozen woman and the burning pages was so wide I could have fallen into it. I did fall into it, but not before it began to frighten me, because the more of her I read, the more the details started to feel like mine. It began with the coast. I had told myself for 2 weeks that the ache the fragments raised in me was ordinary, that any decent writer would ache holding grief this exact. But then I turned a page and found her describing a specific gray coast, a northern one, where the fog comes in every afternoon at 4 as reliably as a tide. And something in my hands went still. I knew that coast, not a coast like it. That one, the light off the water, flat and pewter and merciless, the smell of iron in the rain, a village so small it had 1 shop and 1 blue-doored cottage let by the week to people who wanted to disappear. I had disappeared there once, 7 years ago, in the only true summer of my life, before I learned what I was worth to the people who could afford me. I told myself gray coasts are common, that fog is common, that half the north smells of iron when it rains. And then I turned the page, and she had written the blue door. After the blue door, I stopped sleeping properly. I would work until 2 and 3 in the morning, and I began I am ashamed of this, to read the fragments not as a ghostwriter looking for a book, but as a woman looking for herself, hunting through another person's grief for proof of my own existence. And I kept finding it. A boathouse with a rotten third step you had to skip. A green glass float, kept. The precise way the tide came up over your shoes if you sat too long and let it, because moving would end the afternoon. These are not the sort of details you invent. These are the details you keep. And then, on a torn half-page near the bottom of the case, I found a line in quotation marks, a thing someone had said aloud and she had written down to save. How the person she loved went quiet when a feeling got too big to risk saying wrong. I have that habit. I was doing it right then, in the dark, while my whole careful life began very slowly to come apart. I want to be honest about the two things I felt, because they arrived at once and did not fit together. The first was hope, and it was terrible, because if the coast was my coast, and the blue door my door, and the going quiet my going quiet, then the love Sabine Aldercroft had spent 7 years unable to write, the great buried grief of her whole celebrated life, was me. I was the lost love. I was the one she circled and could not name. After 7 years of being told I had been nothing, here in my own hands was evidence, in her own hand, that I had been the single most important thing that ever happened to her. And the second thing, in the same breath, was horror. Because if it was true, then either she did not know I was ghosting it, or she did and had arranged it, and I could not think of a single reason a person would do such a thing that was not a cruelty I did not think I would survive a second time. So I did what I have always done, which is, I tried to write my way out of it. I built a scaffolding of reasonable explanations and lived inside it as long as it would hold. Coincidence. The North is full of gray coasts and blue doors. I was a lonely woman reading the most intimate thing she had ever written, and of course I was seeing my own face in it. And Sabine could not possibly know she had hired the girl from the coast, because that girl had a different life now, and a name she never used on covers. And Sabine, in any case, had made it clear on a beach at the end of that summer that I had been an experiment she was finished with. And you do not spend 7 years grieving an experiment. It held for about a week. It held until the afternoon I asked her, in my most neutral voice, what the lost love's name had been, because a memoir needs a name. And Sabine Aldercroft turned the silver ring once and did not answer, and looked at me for the first time as though she were afraid. She would not give me the name. That was the thing that finally broke my scaffolding to pieces, because it made no sense any other way. A memoir needs a beloved with a name. The whole house was waiting for it. And Sabine, who answered every other question with 4 cold words, went silent as stone when I asked what to call the woman she had loved, and turned her ring, and changed the subject in a voice that was not quite steady. A person protecting a stranger's privacy gives you a false name and moves on. A person refusing to say a name in front of the very woman it belongs to, that is something else. I drove home and had to pull the car over, because I finally understood, all the way down, what I had refused to understand for a month. She knew. She had always known. The great buried love of Sabine Aldercroft's life was the ghostwriter she had personally hired to build it into a book. And I did not know yet whether that was the cruelest thing anyone had done to me, or the only love letter I would ever be sent. There is no word for what it is to be the unnamed ghost of your own life. I have a large vocabulary. It is my whole trade. And I have never found the word. I went to the house each week and shaped the story of my own heartbreak into elegant, publishable, anonymous prose for a woman who would not look at me directly. And then I went home and wept over notebooks that were, it turned out, about me. I wrote myself in the third person. I gave the girl on the coast a ghostwriter's careful distance, because that was the job and the only way I could bear to touch it. I was being paid an enormous fee to sand my own name off the most important thing that ever happened to me, and hand it back to the woman who had taken my name in the first place. And the unbearable part, the part I could not say to anyone, was that some nights, rebuilding her grief with my own hands, I was happier than I had been in 7 years. That is what she had done to me. That is what I could not forgive and could not stop. Let me take you back to the coast, because you cannot understand the library until you have stood on the boathouse steps. 7 years ago, I was 19 years old, a scholarship student with 2 jobs and no family to speak of, and I had won a small stipend to spend a summer on the northern coast, ostensibly to write, because I had wanted to be a real writer then, under my own name, before I ever learned to be a ghost. I took the cheapest thing available, a cottage with a blue door in a village with 1 shop, and I went there to be alone and to become someone. And there was a woman already there, in the larger house up the headland, who came down to the shore every gray afternoon at 4 when the fog rolled in, and stood at the water in a dark coat and did not speak to anyone. She was 27. She was not famous yet. She was, I would learn, hiding from her grandmother, and a future already decided for her, trying to write one true book before the dynasty closed over her head. Her name was Sabine. She was different then, before the frost fully set. Not warm, exactly. She was never quite warm, but unfinished, reachable, a young writer with ink on her fingers and a haunted quality she had not yet learned to weaponize. The Aldercroft name was already around her neck. I only knew she flinched when her grandmother's calls came through, that she spoke of the house the way other people speak of an illness in the family. But she had run to that coast to be, for one summer, just a woman who wrote, and I was a 19-year-old nobody with no idea who the Aldercrofts were. And I think that was exactly why she could breathe near me. I did not want anything from the air, because I did not know there was an air. I met her on the shore one afternoon when the fog came in and neither of us left, and I said something about the light on the water, and she looked at me as though I had said something no one had ever said to her, and she answered, and we stood in the fog until it was dark. That was the beginning of everything. She read to me, and I read to her, and that was the whole shape of how we fell. Through words, always through words, which is why what came after cut exactly where it did. She brought down the pages of the true book she was trying to write before her grandmother took her, and trusted me with them the way you trust someone with a live thing, and I would tell her where the sentence lied and where it told the truth, and she began to write toward me, for me, until the book she was making and the summer we were having became the same thing. No one had ever asked what I thought before. No one had ever handed me their unguarded interior and waited, actually waited, for my hands. I gave her the only honest account of myself I have ever given anyone, out loud, on those steps. And she listened the way she read, completely, as though I were the only text that had ever held her attention. And by the middle of that summer, I had stopped, entirely being careful. There was a night it rained the way it only rains on that coast, sideways off the water, iron and salt, and we were shut into the little cottage with the blue door rattling in the wind. And she told me the thing she would spend 7 years unable to write, and I would spend 7 years unable to forget. She had been turning that silver ring. Even then she turned it. And she stopped and took my face in both her cold hands and said, "You are the only thing I never had to calculate." She said her whole life had been arithmetic, every want measured against every cost, and that with me, the arithmetic had simply gone quiet for the first time in her memory. I did not know then that I was hearing the truest sentence she was capable of. I only knew that a woman who guarded everything had handed me the unguarded center of herself, in the rain, and that I would have burned down the whole coast before I let anything happen to it. I kissed her, and she let me, and I let her, and the rain went on. I will leave the rest of that night where it belongs, because some things were never meant for the hall. She marked me in the last week of the summer, and it was not reckless. It was the most deliberate thing either of us had ever done, which is exactly why it could not be forgiven later, and exactly why it never faded. We knew what we were. She was an alpha, and I was an omega, and a bond between us was permanent, the real one, the kind you only get to give once and can never give again. And she was Aldercroft. And I was a scholarship nobody. And even in our happiness, we both knew the world above the headland would never sign off on it. So she did it without the world. On the last clear night, on the boathouse steps, with the green glass float between us, she set her mouth to the gland low on my throat and bonded me. A true claim, the kind that writes itself into the scent and does not come off, and said low that whatever happened when the house came for her, this would already be true, and no one alive could make it untrue. I believed her all the way down. I was 19, I had no reason yet not to. Then the summer ended, and she went back up the headland to face the things she had been hiding from, and I stayed in the cottage with the blue door and a bond mark low on my throat, and the whole warm, impossible future built up load-bearing inside my chest. She was going to tell them. She would tell her grandmother that she had chosen and come back down for me, and we would leave before the leaves turned. And for a few days, I believed it the way you believe your own heartbeat, without checking. I sat on the boathouse steps in the afternoons and waited for the fog and for her, and the mark at my throat was warm, and I was, God help me, happy, the last easy happiness of my life. I did not know that up in the big house on the headland, an 80-year-old woman I had never met was already turning me over in her mind like a figure in a ledger, working out precisely what I was worth and how little it would cost to remove me. Honoria Aldercroft never once came down to the shore. She did not have to. I need you to understand Honoria Aldercroft because she is the cold front the whole rest of my life happened under, and because she was not, in the ordinary way, a monster. She was worse than that. She was principled. She genuinely believed the Aldercroft name was a sacred trust, 4 generations of it, and that her granddaughter was its steward, and a steward does not get to want things for herself. Love, to Honoria, was not wicked. It was expensive, an indulgence people of consequence could not afford, and she had watched it ruin a family once and would burn her own arm off before she watched it again. The house that year was not as solid as the world believed. There was a rival dynasty circling. There was a merger on the table that would secure the Aldercroft name for another 50 years. And the merger was to be sealed by a marriage, Sabine's marriage, to an heir of the other house. It had all been arranged before the summer, and Sabine had run to the coast to breathe one last time before the trap closed. And then Sabine had come home and told her grandmother she would not do it. She had told her about me. I have had to reconstruct what happened in that house from the fragments and from what Sabine told me 7 years later. And I will give it to you as straight as I can. Sabine went up the headland and stood in front of the woman who had built her and said she had bonded someone, a real bond, an Omega from the village, and that she was not going to marry the other heir, and that she was leaving. And Honoria did not rage. Women like Honoria never rage. Rage is a loss of position. She listened to the whole of it, her granddaughter's one act of open defiance in 34 years, and then asked mildly whether Sabine had considered what such a choice would cost. Not Sabine, who could survive anything with the name behind her, but the girl, the scholarship girl with 2 jobs and no family, and a whole life she had not built yet. Honoria had by then already found out everything about me there was to find, and she laid it on the table between them, gently, the way you lay down a winning hand, and let her granddaughter look at exactly how much I had to lose. The offer she made was not an offer, and it was not a forgery or a trick. That is what made it so complete. Honoria did not lie to Sabine about me. She did not need to. She explained, with the flat precision of a woman reading terms into a contract, what the 2 futures were. In the first, Sabine kept me, walked away from the merger, the name, the inheritance, and Honoria, freed of any obligation to a granddaughter who had chosen against the house, would spend her considerable resources making certain the Omega who had cost the Aldercrofts their future never rose an inch above the coast she came from. The scholarship, revoked, the references, poisoned. Every door I had clawed toward quietly closed. Not out of spite, she said, out of arithmetic. In the second future, Sabine let me go, cleanly, in a way I would believe, and in exchange, Honoria would leave the girl from the coast alone, to build whatever life she could. One version of me got to be with Sabine and be destroyed. One got to be free. Honoria set it down, turned her granddaughter's own logic against her, and waited. She came down the headland one last time, on a gray afternoon at 4 with the fog coming in, and stood on the boathouse steps where she had bonded me a week before, and took the warm living thing we had made and killed it in front of me with her bare hands. She did not turn the ring. I noticed even then, her hands were perfectly still, which I did not understand until 7 years later, when I learned the stillness was the most expensive thing she had ever done, the whole of her control bent to the single task of not letting me see. She told me it had been an experiment, that she was a writer and writers use people, and that I had been research, a study of a certain feeling she had wanted to understand before she wrote it. She said the bond had been a mistake that would fade. She said, in a voice with nothing in it at all, that I should not embarrass myself imagining a summer had meant to an Aldercroft what it had meant to a scholarship girl from the village. And then she walked back up into the fog and did not look back. And I stood on the steps with the tide coming up over my shoes and did not move because moving would make it real. I left the coast the next morning. I did not keep the cottage the extra weeks the stipend allowed. I could not stand the sight of the blue door. I went back to the city with a bond mark low on my throat that everyone promised would fade in a season and did not, that stayed faintly warm and faintly wrong for 7 years no matter what I believed about the woman who put it there. And I did believe her. That is the part I need you to sit with, because it shaped everything I became. I believed completely that I had been research. It fit every fear I had ever had about myself, every lesson the world had taught the scholarship girl about reaching above her station. And I swallowed it whole, because a thing that confirms your deepest fear is the easiest lie in the world to believe. I decided the mark was a scar from my own stupidity, and I would wear it hidden and never explain it. And somewhere on the train back, I decided I was done wanting things under my own name, that I would take my gift for words and spend it on other people's hearts, safely, invisibly forever. And I did. And so I became a ghost, and I was very good at it, and I have told you why. Because being no one cannot be taken from you the way being someone can. I built a whole career out of the wound she left. I wrote other people's loves because I had decided I did not get to have my own. And I got so skilled at disappearing into other lives that I nearly forgot I had ever wanted a life of my own to appear in. The mark stayed warm. I stopped waiting for it to fade around the 3rd year and learned to live alongside it. The way you live alongside a scar you stop noticing until the weather turns. And every now and then I would catch a thread of something on a cold street. Cedar, rain, ink, the smell of a locked library by the sea. And every animal thing in me would sit up before my mind could stop it. I told no one, ever, that the frost of the whole publishing world had once called me the only thing she never had to calculate. And then Miravos called. Which brings us back to the cold library and the long table, and the two of us pretending. She came down the headland one last time, on a gray afternoon at 4 with the fog coming in, and stood on the boathouse steps. She said, in a voice with nothing in it at all, that I should not embarrass myself imagining a summer had meant to an Aldercroft what it had meant to a scholarship girl from the village. And then she walked back up into the fog and did not look back. And I stood on the steps with the tide coming up over my shoes and did not move because moving would make it real. I left the coast the next morning. I did not keep the cottage the extra weeks the stipend allowed. I could not stand the sight of the blue door. I went back to the city with a bond mark low on my throat that everyone promised would fade in a season and did not, that stayed faintly warm and faintly wrong for 7 years, no matter what I believed about the woman who put it there. And I did believe her. That is the part I need you to sit with. And somewhere on the train back, I decided I was done wanting things under my own name, that I would take my gift for words and spend it on other people's hearts, safely, invisibly forever. And I did. And so I became a ghost, and I was very good at it, and I have told you why. Because being no one cannot be taken from you the way being someone can. I built a whole career out of the wound she left. I wrote other people's loves because I had decided I did not get to have my own. And I got so skilled at disappearing into other lives that I nearly forgot I had ever wanted a life of my own to appear in. The mark stayed warm. I stopped waiting for it to fade around. Miravos called. Which brings us back to the cold library and the long table, and the two of us pretending, both of us, with the whole weight of 7 years balanced on the pretense. I knew by then that the memoir was ours, and I knew by the way she would not say my name and could not meet my eyes and turn the silver ring whenever I got too close, that she knew that I knew. But neither of us said it. I asked my careful, neutral questions, and she gave me her careful, spare answers. And underneath the professional surface, there was a second conversation happening that neither of us would admit to, conducted entirely in the things we did not say. It was the strangest intimacy of my life, more naked than the summer had been. We were both by then world-class at not saying things. Do you know what it is to edit the sentence in which you are told you were loved? I do. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the fragment that said, "You are the only thing I never had to calculate," rewritten a dozen times across 7 years of notebooks, and my paid professional job was to decide where in the memoir it should go, whether to trim it, how to frame it so a stranger would feel its weight. My job was to make our love legible and anonymous for the market. And I did it. That is the thing I am least able to explain, and most need you to believe, that even suspecting the whole commission might be some elaborate cruelty, I could not stop doing the work well, because the work was the only place the two of us had ever been able to reach each other. On the coast, we reached each other through her pages. In the library, we reached each other through the memoir. I shaped her confession with everything I had, and it was the closest thing to being touched by her I had felt in 7 years. And I hated how much I did not want it to end. There was an afternoon it almost broke. The light was going in the cold library, and I had read her a passage I had shaped from her fragments. A boathouse, a green glass float, a girl who went quiet when a feeling got too big. And I read it in my neutral ghostwriter's voice, and watched the great cold author come apart by degrees across the table. Watched her go so still that I finally knew the stillness for what it was. And when I finished, she said not evenly at all, "You made it sound exactly the way it was. How did you make it sound exactly the way it was?" And the whole 7 years rose up in my throat. And her scent was everywhere, cedar and rain and ink, and the mark low on my throat was warm the way it had not been since the coast. And we sat 3 feet apart in the failing "Same time next week, Ms. Aldercroft," in a voice I did not recognize. And I left, and sat in my car and shook for 10 minutes before I could make my hands drive. After that, I could not pretend to myself anymore, whatever I still pretended to her. The mark had woken up. 7 years it had lain warm and wrong and quiet under my collar. And now, one afternoon a week, it went hot. The way it had gone hot exactly once before on a coast, when an alpha decided to keep me. Honoria had built a merger on the belief that the bond was dead, and the bond had simply gone underground on both sides and waited, warm and patient and unkillable, for the two of us to be put back in the same room. And now we were. I stopped sleeping almost entirely in those weeks, and I did the thing I am worst at, which is I sat with a question I did not want the answer to. Why? Not whether. I knew whether. But why would a woman who had cut me out of her life to save it, who had married as she was told and become the Frost the world believed in, reach across 7 years and hire the girl from the coast to ghostwrite the story of their own ruined summer? There were only 2 answers, and I could not bear either. The first was that she was crueler than I had let myself imagine. the researcher calling her subject back to help annotate the study. And the second was so much more dangerous. That a woman built to be unable to say a warm thing out loud had found the one language she trusted and written me a 7 years late love letter, the length of a book, and was waiting, in the only way she knew, for me to read it and decide. I had to know which. And so, on a gray afternoon at 4, I stopped asking careful questions. I confronted her on an ordinary Thursday, with the manuscript nearly done between us. And I did not plan the words. I had planned 100 careful versions and used none of them. I put down my pen and said, "Stop calling me Ms. Ashby." She went very still. I said, "You know, you have always known. You did not hire the best invisible ghost in the country by accident. You hired the girl from the coast on purpose. And you have handed me our own summer in pieces for 3 months, calling me a stranger's name. And I want you to tell me why. And I want you to say my name while you do it." And the great cold author of the whole publishing world, the frost, the recluse, the woman who had not been surprised by anything in a decade, looked at me with 7 years in her face, and her hand went to the silver ring. She set it on the table between us, the way you set down a weapon or a shield, and she said my name. She said Nell, just that, and the whole frozen architecture of her came down. I had never seen her cry, not on the coast, not even at the end of it. She had killed us with perfectly dry eyes, I understand now, at terrible cost. And I had spent 7 years certain the frost went all the way down. It does not go all the way down. It never did. She sat there with her ring off and her hands bare and shaking, and came apart quietly, without hiding it, and said my name again, Nell, like a word in a language she had been forbidden to speak. And then she said, "I have written you into every book I have ever published. Every one. You are in all of them. Unnamed, in the margins, the woman just off the page. I have been ghostwriting you for 7 years, the way you ghostwrite everyone else. And I could not stop. And when they asked me for the love memoir, I knew I could not write it and could not bear anyone else to. I thought you would read it and you would know, and then it would be yours to decide and not mine to ruin again." And then she told me the rest of it, the version I have already given you, because she gave it to me first, that afternoon, with her ring on the table. Honoria, the merger, the 2 futures, the folder of everything I had to lose, turned around on a desk, while I sat on the boathouse steps waiting for the fog and for her. She told me the stillness on the last afternoon, the dry eyes, the flat voice calling our summer research. It had been the most deliberate act of her life, the whole of her control bent to one purpose, which was to make the lie complete enough that I would leave clean and Honoria would let me live free. A kind goodbye would have left the door open and killed me. A sad one would have told her grandmother the bond still breathed. Only cruelty would satisfy the arithmetic. So she had been surgically cruel in the one place she knew would do the job. My deepest fear about myself, and let me walk away hating her. Because a girl who hates you leaves and lives, and a girl who loves you stays and is destroyed. She had chosen the version of me that got to survive. And she had paid for it every day. I want to tell you what I felt, hearing it, because it was not what the films had promised. I did not melt. 7 years is not undone by an afternoon, and I had built a whole self on the belief that I had been research, and you cannot pull the bottom stone out of a person's foundation and expect her to glow with forgiveness. I was angry, angrier than I have ever been, and the anger did not have a clean target, which is the worst kind, because it was Honoria who built the trap, but Sabine who sprang it, because it was done to save me, and it had also broken me, because she had decided, alone, that she got to make the choice about my whole life for me, that she got to suffer nobly while I suffered ignorantly, and never once gave me the dignity of knowing what I was surviving. I said some of that to her, and she took all of it. She did not defend herself. She said, "You are right." She said, "I made your choice for you 7 years ago, and I will not do it again. That is why the truth is in your hands and not on a stage." I did not yet know how much those words would come to mean. She showed me, before I left, the pages she had not been putting in the approved book. A thick stack by then, the real last chapter, the one with my name in it, the one that told the truth the market version had sanded away. And she said she did not know yet whether she would ever use it. It was not for the house. It was not even entirely for me. It was the thing she had needed to write for 7 years and never let herself write. The true end of the story in which the woman she loved had a name, and the reason she lost her had a name too. And the whole machinery of the choice was laid bare on the page. She had written our love 100 times in disguise, she said, and was tired unto death of disguise. But she also knew exactly what putting my name in a published book would cost. Her, the house, the thing with Honoria that could not be unbroken. And she would not do it without me. Being named against your will, she said, is only another way of being used, and she had used me enough for one lifetime. So she gave me the pages, and she said the decision was mine. I did not decide quickly, and I want the record to show that, because underneath the anger, when I got there, was the thing I had been most afraid to find, that the mark on my throat had been telling the truth for 7 years, and I had called it a scar. I had not stopped. She had lied to me and made my choices for me and broken my whole life. And I had spent 7 years writing other people's loves because I could not stop loving her. And now she had put the choice in my hands and stepped back. And for the first time since I was 19 on a boathouse in the fog, the deciding was actually entirely mine. What I did with that comes down to a single page, read aloud in a crowded hall. Before I tell you what I chose, you have to know what it would cost her. Naming me in a published book, telling the truth on the page, the real last chapter instead of the approved one, was not a gesture. It was the detonation of Sabine Aldercroft's entire life. Honoria had built the whole edifice of the house's future on the belief that the coast was dead and buried. The merger, the 50-year security of the Aldercroft name, all of it rested on the granddaughter having chosen the dynasty. To stand up and say in public that she had loved a scholarship Omega, it would turn the sanitized bestseller the house expected into a scandal with her own name on it and mine beside it. She knew all of that. She had done the arithmetic. She was always doing the arithmetic. And for the first time in her life, the sum came out on the side of the expensive thing. But she would not do it for me. She left that too, in my hands. The launch was set for a month out, and the house was building it into an event. The great cold Sabine Aldercroft, emerging from a decade of silence to read in public for the first time, from the love memoir the world had waited for. Honoria would be there, in the front row, presiding. The press would be there. I did the job I was paid to do, down to the last comma, because whatever else I chose, I was not going to sabotage her book. That would have been making her choice for her, and I had just learned exactly what that costs. I handed in the safe version, and I told no one what I meant to do about the other thing. Here is the thing that makes the haul matter. I did not tell her what I decided. I made my choice in the dark, alone, 3 nights before the launch, and I sent no word because I wanted, for once in this whole 7-year arithmetic of people deciding each other's lives, us both to walk into that hall not knowing what the other would do. She did not know whether I would let her name me. We had spent 7 years managing each other's choices. And we walked into that launch having finally, deliberately stopped. 2 people who loved each other agreeing at last to find out what the other would freely do. I took my place at the very back of the hall, where a ghost stands. And I waited in 7 years of disappearing exactly how to be looked at. And I used all of it. And I kept my eyes on hers the whole length of that room, the way I had once kept them on her across a foggy shore. And Sabine Aldercroft watched me come, and the great cold author of the whole publishing world gripped the edges of the podium and forgot every camera in the building, and looked at me with her whole naked heart in her face, and did not turn the ring, because both her hands were holding on. I stopped at the foot of the stage, close enough that her scent reached me over the footlights, cedar and rain and ink, and every animal thing in me turned toward it like a needle. And I did not climb up, because I was not going to be pulled up into her story like the last page of her book. I made her come down to mine. She understood. She had always understood me faster than anyone alive, and she came down off that stage and stood before me on the floor, on the level, the air and the ghost with no podium between them. And she said, "Lo, only for me and for the whole leaning hall, you came." And I said, "You said my name." And she said, "I would say it in every room in the world." And I looked at the woman who had loved me and lied to me and unmade me and grieved me and written me into 100 books she would not sign my name to. And I said the truest thing I had, which was not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness is slower than a hall. I said, "Then you're going to learn to say it to my face, not only to a page. You do not get the girl from the coast back. She waited on those steps, and she is gone. But this one, and I put my hand over the mark, the way she had once put her mouth to it. This one heard you. Start there. I am not going to hand you the wedding, because there was no wedding, and because a bow on this story would be a lie. What there was in the weeks and months after that haul was slower and truer and cost more. The scandal was enormous. The true last page ran in every paper the safe book was reviewed in. The Aldercroft house shook to its 4-generation foundations, and Honoria did exactly what a woman like Honoria does, which is she reached for the old levers and found, for the first time in 50 years, that they moved nothing. She could not poison the references of a woman whose name was suddenly known in every house in publishing. She could not make a scandal disappear that 400 witnesses had watched become real. She could not unsay my name. She cut Sabine off in the end, the way she had always threatened to, and Sabine let her, and walked out of the inheritance and half of that gilded world with her ring in her pocket, and nothing arranged for her for the first time in her life. And the memoir went out with the true last chapter restored, and on the cover, beside hers, in letters the exact same size as hers, for the first time in my whole invisible career, was my name. I did not fall back into her arms in that hall, and I did not fall back into them the next week either. And she did not ask me to. She did the slow thing, the earning thing, the thing she had never once done on the coast, because on the coast she had simply decided us into being and then out of it. She learned to say it to my face. A woman built for 34 years to be unable to want anything out loud sat across a great many tables from me and practiced, badly, with her ring off, saying the plain, warm, true things she had only ever been able to write. And I watched her get better at it, the way you watch someone learn a language late, with effort and embarrassment and a kind of courage I had never given the frost credit for. The bond did not have to be reignited. It had never gone out. It had only been waiting, warm and wrong under my collar and hers, for the two of us to stop lying to it. But we let it come back up into the light. And the thing I am proudest of, the thing the girl on the boathouse steps would never have believed, I stopped writing other people's loves. I started writing my own, under my own name, the one she said out loud in a gilded hall. People ask me now, because people do ask, when your name ends up beside the great Sabine Aldercroft's on the most talked about book of the decade, how I could forgive a woman who looked me in the face and called our whole life research. And I tell them what I have told you, that I did not forgive her in the hall. The hall was not forgiveness, the hall was being seen. Forgiveness came later and slower and is, honestly, still coming in the ordinary daily way. Real things come. What happened in the hall was smaller and larger than forgiveness. What happened is that a woman who had spent 7 years writing everyone else into being visible finally heard her own name said out loud, on purpose, with love, in the largest room she could find, and discovered she had never actually wanted to be no one, that she had only wanted to survive being someone, and that those are not the same thing. I ghostwrite nothing now. I sign everything I write. The mark on my throat is warm all the time now, and neither of us tries to call it a scar anymore. And I have learned the one thing I most needed to know, standing at the back of that hall with a stranger's wine going warm in my hand. A name you are never allowed to say does not die of the silence. It only goes underground and keeps warm and waits for the one mouth brave enough to finally say it out loud, in the largest room in the world and mean it,